Nhlekani vakokwani. Greetings from Musoni. Ntukulu wabangoni ni vandao. Today I just like to quickly answer this question by Brother Tabo Teach. Brilliant question. What precipitated or necessitated or made African royal families to sell the continent to Arabs and Europeans, in your own view, or if you like, according to scholarly literature? So his question was basically based on my tweet, "Betrayal can never be committed by an enemy." Many who claim to be conscious spend a lot of time glorifying Europeans about how they enslaved helpless Africans. But true scholarship shows us how African royal families sold the continent to Arabs and Europeans for a morsel of bread. The simple answer to the question is it all boils down to a masculinity void. In my Twitter thread, what Africans got for their slaves, I basically break down the receipts of things, the exchanges between Europeans and African royals in exchange for a living human being. And all the items broken down under that thread, none of them have any value. It's useless items like iron bars, like tobacco, like brandy, and things like that. And sometimes Eurocentrics tend to use this experience to try and paint a picture where Africans were actually tempted by these things because they'd never seen them before. But the reality also shown in this thread is that Europeans would buy a lot of the items from another part of Africa and go and sell it to another part. It's not that the people didn't know about them. It's just that if you give someone money today and they sell their brother, doesn't mean they've never seen money before. And the most greedy people on earth today are people with a lot of money. I say that it's a question of manhood because African manhood is basically defined by ubuNTU. The definition of ubuNTU is basically the definition of true masculinity. Because ubuNTU is a vow. And for a man to fulfill a vow, it requires sacrifice, self-sacrifice, not the sacrificing of your culture or of other people. That is the opposite of manhood. Selling your brothers and sisters for a morsel of bread is the opposite of manhood. Because for one to do that, they need to lack self-control, they need to be self-centered, and be servants to their passions and desires. In my 4-part series, Samson, the Biblical Allegory to Black Masculinity, I basically break down why the African man became subdued, though he is proven to be the strongest physically, the most talented, the most creative, and yet is a servant of others. Just like Samson, who lacked self-control, and he was driven by his desire for the enemy's beauty. And so African men sold African women and other men for barrels of brandy and other useless items. So, and I also call it a spirit of harlotry, the spirit of ubufebe, because the spirit of yabujakota in Xitsonga, because prostitution at the end of the day is an unequal exchange. Is when you exchange something more valuable, something that is priceless, for something that is temporal and has a lower value. So in a nutshell, what motivated African royalties to become the doorway for European imperialism and Arab imperialism is due to their lack of masculinity. It's a masculinity void that was introduced by the coming of the age of Pisces, which represent the age of selfish desires, where human beings are largely driven by their appetites and childish desires. And of course, we cannot just solely blame African royalties on for the spirit of harlotry or butlakuta, because they are a product of the societies from which they came. So the issue of masculinity is not just a problem amongst the African royals, it's a problem amongst within the African society as a whole, and it is still a problem today. And I'm going to quickly show one last example by which this spirit of harlotry manifests, or the spirit of a masculinity void manifests itself amongst ordinary people. And to make the point, I want to make reference from this very legendary text by a legendary scholar, Dr. Amos Wilson, Issues of Manhood in Black and White. Let's read. Dependency bred by domination, the feeling of not being in control. Remember, masculinity is about having self-control, or having no say over what happens in their personal and community lives. Feelings of relative powerlessness, the overwhelming desire to achieve a sense of power and control by self-defeating and antisocial means, particularly in the adolescent and young male, manifest themselves in ways which adversely affect the physical and mental health. Talk about mental health, abusing yourself and abusing others. Holistic and occupational achievement, social and sexual attitudes and relations to African American youths and youth adults. Black on black violence is one of the critically negative manifestations of an absence of sense of control bred by oppression. So one of the ways in which this masculinity void manifests itself is escapism, is escaping from certain realities. For example, the reality that as African people, we are at war. So if one can pretend like there is no war and people are imagining things, then they can hide from that responsibility that is required from a man to defend his community. And I'm sure you've seen this phenomenon in all these people who say they don't see color.
I believe the majority of black South Africans are racist. And I don't like this argument of black people cannot be racist. Per definition, if you discriminate against someone based on their race, that makes you racist. The fact that you're discriminating against someone who's rich, who's powerful, who is a legacy, who has inherited and has privilege from racism and colonization, that is not important. That comes secondary. But you are faced as a black person, select someone, hire someone, invest in, will not support that person because they are white.
Dr. Amos Wilson also explains the psychology behind this thinking. So to think that black people using their experience with white people to have their first instinct of not trusting them, if you think that is prejudice, you are very ignorant. Because we know for a fact that if you found a non-poisonous snake in your house, you'd probably panic and probably want to kill it if you don't have the deep knowledge of snakes. It takes one who has deep knowledge of snakes to be able to understand the nature of the snake, which one to kill and which one to leave alone. Likewise, to understand racism, one has to have a very deep knowledge of psychology and history. It is not just a mere judgment that you make based on your personal feelings. Dr. Robin DiAngelo is a white woman, a Caucasian woman, wrote a book, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. So in this text, just like Jane Elliott, many people probably know her. If you don't know her, you can check out on YouTube. She's held classes with white people, actually revealing to them that they are inherently racist and they're not even aware. And Dr. Robin DiAngelo goes deep into that psychology and explains that especially your liberals, the ones that claim not to be racist because of their own personal actions, are the ones that are mostly racist. And so the first step to trusting a white person is for them acknowledging the reality that they are inherently racist, and for them to not be racist had to educate themselves, and also revealing and not being defensive about the benefits that they've received, or that they have, or that they gain the privilege. They don't defend privilege and try and speak this multiculturalism language. So that is the first step to at least earning trust of black people. So when a black person makes the argument that black people are also racist, it's not coming from an intellectual space, but it comes from a psychological space where they use that as a form of escapism due to their masculinity void. They are trying to close it up. An emotional reaction to their cowardice and anxiety of facing the reality. Because I don't think this kid is not intelligent enough to actually look up the word prejudice. Because the word prejudice says is a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason and actual experience. So if someone has a preconceived ideas based on reason and experience, it is not prejudice. It's called common sense. When you tell your child to not speak to strangers or take gifts from strangers, you are not being prejudiced against strangers. You are speaking based on experience of the criminal activity that has been happening in the latter days that we're living in, as opposed to the older days when a stranger was a friend, and a stranger could help a child who is lost and walking astray, as we used to have it in Africa in the days of ubuNTU. And I don't think there's anyone who's dumb enough to not know that black people have enough experience and reason. 500 years is quite adequate for black people to develop a reason and based on that experience to be very wary of white people. In reality, there is no black person who actually dislikes white people because of how they look. There's no black person who says, I hate white people because they have this hair that comes out this way, or they have blonde hair and blue eyes. None of these concepts have ever come out of African people in ancient times or in modern times. So you can see clearly that this kid is not speaking from any form of intellect, but from an emotional, a masculinity void perspective. Because if one is to resolve a case of violence and of one person reporting being slapped, and then the other person comes and says, but he slapped me first, then you can easily dismiss that and say, well, both sides are guilty. And that makes your job easier. It is very different when there's only one violator there, where you have to exercise judgment. There is no dismissing of the case. You have to face it head on. It is based on the human experience that snakes can actually kill you. And that experience is not a personal experience, but a human collective experience. Because most people that are afraid of snakes today have never been bitten by one. So in conclusion, the masculinity void that has led the African royals to selling us African people is not an isolated thing that only exists among African royals, but these African royals are a reflection of the communities out of which they came, because we can see these elements found amongst ordinary African people. A lot of African people still hold the same values that these African royals hold. In this text, Dr. Amos Wilson breaks it down really well. On page 2 of the text, it says the general system would make us think that the criminal behavior, black on black violence, or violence in general, is the result of some criminal tendencies in the individual. That somehow the criminal is greatly different from the rest of the people in the population. And that there is some type of twisted values. We try to illustrate in this particular text how those things that motivate black on black violence and criminality are continuous with the standard everyday values. As a matter of fact, the black on black violent criminal is very much what I call a bourgeois criminal. The things he's attacking black people for are the same things that the good old black middle class struggles so hard for, not different. They are different only in technique and approach, but it indicates that there is a sharing of values between what we call a black on black criminal and what we call a normal law-abiding citizen. You can look around you, go to social media and see what black people spend time putting their attention to. When a person says if South Africans were as organized and united as Thabo and Nandi, they would get their land and mines tomorrow. United people can achieve anything. So the issue here is that people will use criminals as an example of unity, when common sense should tell you that criminals, they're only there to serve themselves. And shortly after this tweet, the lady stated that she was forced by the guy. Where is the unity there? This is why a black person can tweet for a grade 5 dropout. Thabo Bester, the criminal, the rapist, and the murderer, is extremely intelligent. If you listen to him speak, he sounds like a graduate. And for such a tweet to receive 3,555 likes is an indication of a problem in the black community. Well, someone might argue that I don't know what color people actually tweeted that, blah, blah, blah. But I know that white people are not going to go and like some criminal who is not part of their community. And you can make the argument that it's just Twitter. But go and look in any black community. You'll see that children do not look up to any scholars, any doctors, as we used to when some of us were growing up back in the 80s. You saw the biggest house in the neighborhood, a double-story house, belonged to some doctor and things like that. When children are looking around in the black community, they see the glorification of criminals. Criminals have the nicest things, the material things, and so the children look up to them. And the people that are supposed to be heroes in the black community look like losers. And everybody that understands politics, that knows that all politicians are criminals. But a lot of majority among black people, there is this factionalism that's happening, where there's one group of black people hates speaking against this one politician and defending this other politician. And when I say that all politicians are criminals, I'm not talking in their personal capacity, but that they are working for a criminal system, because the democratic system that is running in this country is a criminal system set by criminals from Europe. Is a colonial system. So in conclusion, to answer the question, what precipitated Africans, for African royals to sell the continent to Europeans and Arabs, it is because it is a common consciousness amongst Africans. It has been then, it is still is today. The common African consciousness is that of betraying ubuNTU and glorifying criminals amongst ourselves, because we have held up European values where the conqueror, the thief, the hijacker is the hero. From your brother Musoni, Ntukulu wabangoni ni bandau. Thank you for watching. Like the video, share the video. If you've not subscribed to the channel, press that subscriber button. Peace and African power.